I have been fired from one job in my life, and that job was being a drawing class model. Before you jump to conclusions about why I was fired, let me explain. This was during my second year of college, and it was one of the busiest years of my life. I took a couple years of college classes while I was still in high school, so I only really got the traditional college experience of living on campus for 2.5 years. So in my second year of living on campus, it was academically my senior year. And I had this realization that my college experience of always being around my friends was going by really quickly, and I felt like I was going to miss out. So I took the opportunity to fill my schedule to the brim so that I didn't miss out. I had missed out on 2 years of the college experience, so I felt as though I had to make up for that lost time. So that semester, I had a full 18 credit course workload. I had a 16-hour per week internship. I worked a student job doing graphic design for the music department. I had another student job working as a teacher's assistant in the graphic design computer labs, helping underclassmen with their projects. And on top of those jobs, I volunteered to lead the graphic design club on campus, and I helped organize events for the departments. And I volunteered to work at the student newspaper on Saturdays. So when a professor of mine asked if I would be a model for her figure drawing class, of course I said yes. It was only 3.5 hours a week, and what was one more job on top of the 3 that I already had? And just to set the record straight, this was a Christian college, so yes, I was fully clothed for this class. But the class period that I needed to model for was the only free spot in my entire schedule. The rest of my days and nights and weekends were completely full. That year, I was also working on my senior art gallery project, and the gallery coordinator needed to schedule a block of time with me to go over the pieces in the gallery. She only needed about a half hour of my time, but because my schedule was completely booked, she suggested time after time, but there was always some sort of class or work or internship conflict. And then she asked if I was free on a Wednesday at 10:20, and I said no, that was the time I needed to model for the drawing class. She responded by immediately firing me from that job as the drawing model. And to this date, that's the only job I've been fired from. And the reason I was fired was because the words "enough is enough" were not in my vocabulary. As I tried to make the most out of my experience at college, I thought that packing more into my schedule would be the thing that made my experience better. It took someone else to step into my life and to fire me from my 4th job for me to get it through my skull that more doesn't always equal better. Someone else had to say enough is enough because I didn't know how to say it for myself. Maybe you feel like that too. In the endless effort to make the most out of our short lives on earth, we try and pack our lives full. We also think that more equals better, so we fill our schedules with work and activities and sports and pleasure because we don't know how to say enough is enough. None of these things are bad. In fact, they might even be good things, but one by one they add up and they start to take over our lives. And then we crash and we burn out and we end up doom scrolling on our phones, or we binge watch Netflix for 8 hours straight because we're burned out and we can't sleep because of it. And then again, we look at our phones and we're hit with messages from influencers on social media that tell us we should be doing more, we should be buying more, we should be making more, we should be being more. Because then you might be enough. Just like me in college, society doesn't have the words "enough is enough" in its vocabulary. So, for you, when is enough enough? Will it be enough when you've bought enough clothes that they overflow your closet? Will it be enough when you've scrolled so much Instagram that you get to the end of the infinite scroll? Will it be enough when you've watched every angle of every game, of every play, every week? Will it be enough when you've finally caught up on that new show that all your coworkers are talking about? Will you be a good enough student when you've stayed up all night studying to ace that test? Will you be a good enough mom when your home finally looks like the Pottery Barn catalog? Will you be a good enough dad when you've driven your 12-year-old to their 1,000th soccer game? Will you be good enough when you buy that $500 driver as you try and get your golf handicap down? Will it be enough when your house, your calendar, or your garage are all completely full? Will it be enough when you have a panic attack because you don't feel like you're good enough? For me, I needed someone to step into my life and to force me to say enough is enough, to force me to slow down. If I've already lost you and you're not paying attention because you're thinking of what you need to get done and have to do after church, maybe you need to slow down a little bit. Maybe we all need to slow down a little bit. But in the Bible, God helps us slow down. He institutes a rule for his people to remind them that he is enough. God gives Moses, the leader of the Israelites, 10 commandments for his people to follow. And he gives them these commandments right after God frees them from slavery in Egypt. This is a new nation, and these are the first 10 laws for this newly created nation. And this is the fourth commandment. Found in Exodus 20, it reads, "Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God." Now, in the 21st century, the word Sabbath has kind of fallen out of fashion. So if you don't know what it means, the word Sabbath means rest. The Sabbath is simply a full day of rest where you stop your work. And a simple day off might not seem like that big of a deal to us today, but in that time period, to a people that had just been freed from slavery, it was revolutionary. But that's not the end of the command. So let's read on. "On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male servant or your female servant, or your livestock, or the sojourner who is within your gates." So we had the command, and here we have the specifics of it. Because you just know if these specifics weren't there, someone would want to weasel their way out of it or just force someone else to do their work instead. The shorter of a rule is, the more wiggle room there is for someone to escape it. But God is clear. No one shall work, not you, your servants, even your animals. Because you're more. But now we have the command, we have the specifics, but we're more likely to follow a command if we have the why. So God doesn't stop there. He gives us the command, he gives us the specifics, and he gives us the why. God says, "For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy." God rested when his creation was complete. And so too, he tells us to rest. After he created the world and everything in it, God took a look at what he had created and said, "This is very good." So he stopped. God said, "Enough is enough." If God can create all the animals and everything on earth and all of creation in just 6 days, I'm sure what he could have created if he kept working would have been incredible. But he stopped and he rested. Now, I and you both know that the all-powerful creator of the world was not tired from creating. He did not need to rest, but he did anyway. Why? Well, God is the type of leader that when he commands you to do something, he's going to demonstrate it for you. He is going to do it himself. So he showed us how to stop working and how to say enough is enough and to rest. So he enjoyed what he created. So like God who stopped creating, we too should stop our work to enjoy what we have created. But that's not the only reason for the command. That's not the only why. In the Bible, God gives the 10 Commandments twice. The first one, which we just read in Exodus, was given to the Israelites right after he freed them from captivity. And again, he gives the 10 Commandments 40 years later to a new generation of Israelites right before they enter the Promised Land. And when God gives this command the second time, the first two parts of the command are the same. But this time, to the new audience, the last part changes. The why changes. The reason for the command is different. Not because the command itself is different, the command is the same, but the audience is different and needed a different reminder. In Deuteronomy 5, the last part of the fourth commandment says this: "Remember that you were once slaves in Egypt, but the Lord your God brought you out with his strong hand and powerful arm. That is why the Lord your God has commanded you to rest on the Sabbath day." To this new generation of Israelites before they entered the Promised Land, God reminds them that he is their rescuer. They were once slaves, but that was 40 years ago. That's a long time. So when God gives the command again, he reminds them that God freed them from captivity. He freed them from their slavery. And when they were slaves, they couldn't decide when to work or when to rest, but when God freed them, they could rest. Because they knew that there was nothing they could have done to free themselves. It was only God who could rescue them. So they can rest knowing that God is enough to rescue them. Sabbath rest is the act of remembering that God is enough. God was their protector, their provider, so the Israelites could rest knowing that God was on their side. They didn't need to keep working. They didn't need to keep striving because they had been freed from their captivity and freed from their slavery, and God would always be enough for them. Of course, just as God rescued the Israelites from the Egyptians when they were slaves and couldn't free themselves, so too we were captive. We were all bound by sin and we were unable to free ourselves. So God sent us a new rescuer, Jesus. And by the time Jesus came, the Israelites had taken that simple command to rest that we just read, and they had blown it completely out of proportion. According to Jewish laws by the time Jesus came on the scene, the rules had gotten so out of control that you couldn't even light a candle in your own home on Sabbath, but you could hire a Gentile to do it for you. That's convoluted, right? The religious leaders of the time had taken that simple and sacred command to rest and remember and had turned it into a time of stress and walking on eggshells. And I don't want to sound like I'm pointing fingers at them because we're guilty of this too. Take the holidays, for example. These are supposed to be a wonderful festive time where we spend quality time with our family and our loved ones, and yet we turn the holidays into stressful events where the decor has to be perfect, and the gifts have to be perfect, and the food has to be perfect. My family hosted Thanksgiving for the first time this year, and I was so worried about the turkey and the rest of the food turning out perfectly that I didn't say hello to one of our guests until she had been there for 20 minutes. In our efforts to make something perfect, we turn something sacred into something stressful. I remember my coworker was telling me one time about this little holiday tradition that she did with her kids called Elf on the Shelf. And if you don't know what this is one of Santa's helpers that spies on the kids in the house, and it comes alive at night, and it has to be in a different location of the house every morning. So every night after her kids were in bed, she had to stress to find some new hiding spot for it in some creative location, and it was just stressing her out. The pressure she was putting on herself was making Christmas worse. In an effort to make something good into something perfect, we lose the essence of what makes it good in the first place. That's what the Pharisees did. They lost sight of what made Sabbath good by putting more rules on it to try and make it perfect. So on the scene comes Jesus, and of course, as he does, he clashes with these religious leaders. Now, he clashed with them about a lot of things, but he argued with them about the Sabbath more than anything else. And in response to the stressing and the overzealous rules and regulations of the religious leaders, Jesus said this to them: "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." The laws around the Sabbath were intended to bring people closer to God, but those laws had only given them an impossible burden to carry on their way to get to God. Jesus came to make our way to God easy. The rest Jesus gives us is the rest from the stress and the striving on our own merit to try and get to God. We couldn't do it on our own. So Jesus gives us rest from trying to save ourselves, and he takes it upon himself. Just as the Israelites couldn't save themselves from slavery, we couldn't save ourselves from our sin. So Jesus says, "Relax. You can't do this yourself. Only I can do it for you." Jesus reframes the Sabbath rest from the focus on the rules and the regulation and the stress to be focused on him. So now, Sabbath rest is the act of remembering that Jesus is enough. Jesus is enough to free you from your sin. Jesus is enough to bring you into right standing with God. Not by anything you have done or could do. Jesus is the true rest because Jesus is enough. So that begs the question then, what about the Sabbath? What about the day of rest? What about commandment number 4? If Jesus came to free us from the burden of the law, if Jesus is the true rest because he frees us from our sin, what does that mean for us today? Now, obviously, we don't follow all the laws and the commands of the Old Testament today. So is the Sabbath one of those rules that we need to follow or not? Well, the Sabbath can be a hot topic of debate in Christian circles, and there's been entire Christian denominations that have split and formed because of this topic. So I'm not going to get too much into it, but the only thing I'm going to say is this. In the 10 Commandments, commandment number 6 is "Thou shalt not murder." And no one today seems to be arguing about whether or not we still have to follow that command. No one seems to argue that we are free from the command, "Thou shalt not murder." In fact, no one seems to argue about any of the other 9 commands. They are all still followed and taught by Christians to this day. But in this modern day 2024, soon to be 2025, you never really meet any Christians who practice a day of rest. It's almost like us as modern Christians reacted against the oppressive and stressing rules around the Sabbath by swinging that pendulum in the total opposite direction. Our weekends are now for yard work and our house projects and for shopping and for shuttling the kids off to activities and sports, and there's no rest to be found. In our efforts to rid ourselves of the oppressive rules around the Sabbath, we threw the baby out with the bathwater and we got rid of the Sabbath rest itself. It's like there's this Sabbath spectrum. And on one end of the spectrum, you have no rules around it, and that's where we are now. And of course, as humans tend to do, you fill that day with stuff. If you have no rules around it, you're gonna fill it. The stuff itself isn't inherently good or inherently bad, but if you have that space, you will fill it. No rules, no rest. But on the other extreme end of the spectrum is the Pharisaical Sabbath, that first century Sabbath, where you have so many rules around it that you can't truly rest because you're stressed the entire time about breaking the rules. Too many rules, no rest. On both ends of this spectrum, you have no true Sabbath rest. And in the middle, we find Jesus. Somewhere in the gray area between both extreme ends of the spectrum, there is true rest in Jesus. Jesus is the source of our true rest because he is enough. Time and again, Jesus broke the man-made rules around the Sabbath to heal people. So he clearly wasn't on that end of the spectrum. He clearly didn't agree with having so many rules that it got in the way of true rest. But he also isn't on this end of the spectrum. He never rebukes the practice of Sabbath altogether. So what does Jesus have to say about the practice of Sabbath at its core? Jesus says this in Mark chapter 2. The Sabbath was made to meet the needs of people, and not people to meet the requirements of the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even over the Sabbath. Now, if we think about this for a second, of course, Jesus would never rebuke the practice of Sabbath itself because he was the one who made it. Jesus, who was present and active in the creation of the world in the very beginning, was the one who instituted the Sabbath day of rest and the one who demonstrated it to us. Jesus, who is the Son of Man, is Lord of the Sabbath because he gave it to us. And he gave it to us not so that we could make oppressive rules about it that stress us out and prevent true rest. He gave it to us because the Sabbath was made to meet the needs of people. People need the Sabbath. So that begs the question, why do people need to Sabbath? What is it about us that makes us need the Sabbath? Well, if we go back to the beginning, God's creation, according to his own admission in the narrative, was very good. But because Adam and Eve disobeyed God and sinned, they believed that God wasn't enough for them. They were discontent, and thus they looked outside of God and his gifts for them for meaning and for purpose. They had the thought that more equals better. And ever since that first sin, humans have a bias to think that more equals better. Just like Adam and Eve, we become discontent with where we're at. We become discontent with God and his blessings in our lives, so we start looking outside of him for more. And this is called additive bias. When we get discontent or unhappy or we have a problem in our lives, we tend to believe that adding something to our lives will fix it, that adding something to our lives will make them better. Just like Adam and Eve did, we are biased to look outside God and his gifts because we think that more equals better. There's an engineering professor and researcher at the University of Virginia whose name is Leidy Klotz, and he was researching this additive bias, and he conducted some experiments about it. And one of his experiments was creating a travel itinerary for Washington, D.C. I've been to D.C., and you could spend an entire week there and still not see everything. There's a lot to do. But Leidy created this absolutely insane travel itinerary that was only one day long. But that one day had more than 14 stops in it. And he takes this itinerary for his experiment and he runs it by his test subjects. And he prompts them with the questions, what would you change? How would you make this one-day trip better? And 80% of his subjects look at that itinerary with 14 things in it, and they add more. Now, this itinerary was already jam-packed, and to account for drive time, they would only be spending like 15 minutes at each stop. Not enough to enjoy it, and yet people were biased to add more because we have the bias to think that more equals better. They ignored the simple solution to making that trip itinerary better, which is to remove some stops, reduce the drive time, and give more people time to enjoy each stop. He ran another experiment to research this additive bias, and this time he builds a Lego table that was uneven. And there's 4 legs in this table, and one of the 4 legs is longer than the others, so the entire thing is unstable and uneven. He tells his subjects to fix the table, to make it stable, and 59 out of the 60 subjects in his experiment, they add more blocks to the other 3 legs to fix it. They overlooked the simple answer, which was to shorten one leg that was longer to fix the table. Even when he tried to get his subjects to take away a block, he prompted them to remove some. He would punish them for adding more, and yet they didn't find the simple solution to shorten one block because they were still biased towards more. Sometimes the simplest solution isn't to add, it's to subtract. Not to do more, but to do less. Leidy wrote a book called Subtract, The Untapped Science of Less, where he argues that we need to fight to overcome our additive bias. We instead should look at the world not through the lens of our natural additive bias, but we should look at the world through the principle of subtraction. Think of New Year's resolutions, right? New Year's resolutions, they always try and improve our lives to make them better. And I would estimate that about 95% of these New Year's resolutions add something to our already packed lives. We want to improve our lives, but our additive bias says we need to add something to make our lives better. But adding so much isn't making us better. It's making us worse. According to a recent Gallup poll, Americans are getting less sleep than ever before in our history. And I didn't need a poll to tell me that because I could just assume that's true. We have more access to entertainment in our pockets than ever before in the history of the world. Why would anyone want to sleep? But along with getting less sleep, we're also more stressed than ever before. And those 2 risk factors of a lack of sleep and high stress put you at a high risk of diabetes, of heart attack, and of stroke. A lack of sleep and high stress reduce your productivity at work, make you irritable, make you tired, make you depressed. Do you want a New Year's resolution to improve your life? Sometimes the simplest solution isn't to add, it's to subtract. Maybe you feel like a slave to your calendar and you're stressed out and you're always shuttling your kids from one activity to the next without end. The simple solution to that isn't to add yoga or a mindfulness app or another activity to keep track of. It's to subtract. Or maybe you feel like your marriage isn't what it could be and it's in trouble. And you've tried adding vacations together or even therapy or mutual hobbies to do together and nothing seems to be working. Sometimes the simple solution isn't to add. It's to do less so that you have more restful time together as a couple. It's to subtract. Call it subtraction, call it minimalism, or call it, as God calls it, to Sabbath. To stop working, striving, and stressing, and to recognize that He is enough. God rested on the 7th day because He looked at what He had made and He knew it was very good. Sabbath rest is the act of stopping and subtracting. God gave us commandment number 4 because He knows that pausing to stop and to rest is better than our additive bias for more. Why was the Sabbath given to us? The Sabbath was made because our sinful nature prevents us from saying enough is enough and resting. We Sabbath to do less so that we can remember that God is enough, that Jesus is enough. That command to rest, it's a gift. a gift to a people enslaved by the Egyptians, enslaved by their calendars, enslaved by their obligations, and enslaved by their additive bias. Sabbath rest is a gift. So, if Sabbath is a gift, what do you do with a gift? Well, it depends on the gift, of course. Maybe if it's a gift that you don't want or you don't need, you politely say thank you and then you stuff it away in a closet, or maybe you re-gift it or you donate it. But if it's a good gift, if that gift is something you really need, you use it. And as you use that gift, it reminds you of the one who gave it to you. I think for a lot of Christians, Sabbath rest is one of those gifts that we've received, but we've stuffed it away in our closets because we don't know what to do with it. We've ignored it. But back in the slower pace of life, even in the first century, Jesus said that Sabbath was made to meet the needs of people. So how much more in our fast-paced, never-stopping, always connected, modern 21st century reality do we need it? How much more do we need to pause, to slow down, and remember that Jesus is enough? In my story at the beginning, I mentioned that I was fired from that job because my schedule was too full for a meeting. And that meeting that I couldn't schedule was about my upcoming art gallery installation. As a graphic design major, we got the opportunity in our senior year of college to display a piece in the campus gallery. Well, here's the irony of that project. I'm going to put a picture up of the final piece that was installed. Now, so you don't have to count it, I'll do it for you. It's 7 rows, 24 columns. That's 168 pieces in total, and that's the amount of hours in your week. Each row on that wall was twice as long as the one below it until the top row stuck out more than 3 feet away from the wall towards you. When you stood in front of it, it was like looking at a wave that was about to crash into you. Except that wave was your week. As a part of this project for 2 weeks, I tracked the time of everything that I did in 15-minute increments. It wasn't really about the art piece in the gallery itself, but I wanted to know where my 168 hours were going. Because at that time, I thought that if I could somehow find ways to fit more into that time, I would be better off for it. My additive bias told me that it would improve my life to fit more into that 168 hours. I thought that if I did a thorough enough examination of what I was doing, I would somehow discover a pocket of time where I could do more. I now know that was foolish. And clearly my professor did too, since she fired me from my job for the sole reason that I was too busy. Sometimes a little margin and a little rest is worth more than whatever you could fill that time with. That's why God created Sabbath. That's just one of those rows. You have 168 hours in your week. We all do. God told you to rest for 24 of them. Could you do it? I don't care if it's a Tuesday, a Saturday, a Sunday, whatever would fit into your life. Think of what it would take for you to rest for 24 hours. No work, no striving, no keeping up with the Joneses, just resting. And remember that what you have is enough, that Jesus is enough. What would that look like for you? And not the kind of rest where we doom scroll and we binge watch that comes from crashing and it makes you feel sick afterwards. Not the tension-filled family vacation kind of rest where you're so stressed about it going perfectly that you can't relax. Not the rest where you're checking your phone the whole time because you're not present where you're at. True rest, refreshing rest. Maybe it's a family movie night and ordering pizza so you don't have to figure out what to cook. Maybe it's a bonfire and drinks with your friends. Maybe it's a long walk or a bike ride or a hike. The kind where you don't need to worry about how long you're gone because you have nothing else you need to do. Maybe it's a long book and a fireplace. Maybe it's finally getting coffee with that friend that you've been meeting to catch up with, but you haven't had time. What does rest mean for you? And now that you have an idea of something restful, think about what in your life it would take for that to happen. What would it take for you to Sabbath? Be honest with yourself. You might have to subtract something to Sabbath. You might have to put something off. You might have to remove something from your life to rest. But the act of subtraction just might make your life better than whatever else you could add. If you can overcome that human additive bias, that sinful additive bias, you can realize that sometimes subtracting is the best solution. But if you're anything like me, you're probably starting to stress out. You're wondering, when am I going to do my laundry? When am I going to grocery shop? When am I going to clean? When am I going to mow the lawn? How am I going to fit it all in? If I have a day of rest on a Sunday, what are we going to eat if I don't grocery shop? God has an answer for that. You see, not only did the Israelites have a Sabbath day, but God also commanded them later on in Leviticus to have a Sabbath year. So after 6 years of farming the land, in the 7th year, they wouldn't farm, they wouldn't plant. Now, of course, this is also just good, sustainable farming practice that God put into place so that they didn't deplete the soil of its nutrients. But just like you were, they were probably wondering, what are we going to eat? How will we provide for ourselves if we rest? So God told them this. You may ask, what will we eat in the 7th year if we do not plant or harvest our crops? I will send you such a blessing in the 6th year that the land will yield enough for 3 years. That's God's heart for Sabbath rest. God doesn't want your rest to be stressful. God said He would provide for the Sabbath, for the Israelites in their Sabbath year. If God can work a miracle and provide 3 years worth of harvest in 1 year, I believe that God can provide for your 1 day of rest. I believe that God's blessing will make up for whatever you subtract to make room for Sabbath. Sabbath rest is a gift to a people enslaved by the Egyptians, by their obligations, and by their additive biases. Because we don't know how to say enough is enough, God showed us how, and then He commanded us how. Sabbath rest is the act of remembering that Jesus is enough. That day of rest is a gift. I'm not here to tell you how to use that gift. I'm not going to give you a list of rules of how to use that gift. All I'm here to tell you is to take that gift. Pull it out of the closet if that's where you have it. Dust it off if you haven't used it in a while, and use it. And then, when you use it, see how God uses it. Let's pray. Lord, we thank you for the gift of Sabbath. We thank you that you care enough to let us rest and that you commanded us to rest because we don't know how. We don't know how to stop striving, to stop working, to stop stressing, and we thank you that you showed us how. I pray that each one of us would take a look at our lives and that you would help us to Sabbath, that you would help us to rest and remember that you are enough. We thank you for your gift of Sabbath. Amen.